This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders who are designing the future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and my guest today is Parul Somani, author of The Path of Least Regret, Decide with Clarity, Move Forward with Confidence. A graduate of MIT and Harvard Business School, Parul built her career at Bain & Company and in Silicon Valley startups before a cancer diagnosis at age 31 reshaped how she thinks about decisions and life. She went on to develop the Path of Least Regret framework, which leaders and organizations use to make clear, intentional decisions. Parul, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. And you know how the kids say, people coming in hot? Well, picking up your book, you came in hot by opening about this life-altering cancer diagnosis shortly after the birth of your daughters. Why was it so important to, I know I'm glibly saying coming in hot, but why was it so important to start there when you were telling your story?
It was important for me to start there because that moment was truly the genesis of the words, the path of least regret in my life, the framing of that even being a decision-making lens. And it was truly transformational, not only in coming up with this framework that I wanted to share with people, but in also transforming who I was as a person in terms of realizing what is important to me, what are my priorities, how do I actually want to spend my life, what's the legacy I want to leave behind. That whole experience put my life on this professional path from what I was doing before to now wanting to eventually share this.
And you talk about this transformation you went under, and you talk about the fact that before this all happened, you were all about the data, research, analysis, and this sort of changed that. But as a leader and in someone in business, you still have to carry some of that stuff. Like like I always joke that CEOs always want to see data unless it's one of their decisions. So tell me how you mix in the idea of the gut and the stuff that helped you evolve to keeping the old power rule in the picture and this analytical and data-driven mind.
Yeah. So, I mean, just for context, my background is intellectual engineering and computer science, major in college. I went to business school for my MBA. I was fully deep in the corporate career track, management consulting, tech startups, after. And I found comfort in data. Like that's where we were sort of trained to look for answers because you just crunch the numbers enough, you keep researching, you keep doing the analysis, and the right answer should appear. And what I realized in that moment when I needed to make a decision of my treatment plan is that I could continue collecting and looking at the data of what clinical studies have been done. What are the 5 people in Norway who went through some treatment plan? Like, how did it work out for them? I can look at the recurrence rates and try to understand the toxicity of the side effects. But in none of that research would ultimately the answer of which treatment plan do I want to pursue actually emerge as a clear and right and certain answer, because it was all a decision of weighing risks, of weighing trade-offs with no outcome. Like, I didn't know if I go this path, I definitely won't get a recurrence. If I go this path, I definitely won't have long-term toxic side effects. And when doctors were turning to me and saying, what treatment plan do you want to pursue? That's when I realized that I'm the one who's going to have to live with those outcomes. And the success of that decision can't lie in an outcome that I can't control. And I felt like it had to lie in the process that I then went through to make the decision. And so collecting the data, doing the analysis was an integral part of that. I definitely wasn't going to ignore that. And the way I'm wired wasn't going to allow for me to ignore that either. But I also knew that if I just kept looking in the data for the answer, then I would be trapped in indecision. I would be in analysis paralysis, and I would never actually figure out what that right answer is. And so ultimately I had to look inward, taking the information I had read, taking in the analysis I had consumed, and ultimately deciding, well, which of these paths is going to give me the most peace of mind.
Let's look into sort of that question, what the path of least regret, because I think we're all familiar with the path of least resistance. Where did the
Yeah.
idea of path of least regret come from and becoming central to your thinking?
So, like I shared, my background in college was electrical engineering and computer science, and this concept of the path of least resistance comes from electrical engineering. And for me, when it came to decision making, it was thinking of it as like, what's the easy answer, right? Like which path forward is like clearly the easy way to move ahead. And when I was faced with this life dependent decision of how to move forward through a cancer journey, it just became very clear to me that there was no easy answer. And that was literally the mental thinking that I went through, is that there is no path of least resistance. And so I'm going to choose my path of least regret. And when I went through my cancer journey, I actually blogged it real time. So it's called New Job, New Baby, New Cancer. And I documented all the ups and downs of going through an experience like that as a young mother. And there is a July 2014 post where I actually wrote about this decision making, like, point of my treatment plan. And I titled that blog post The Path of Least Regret. And so this wasn't a framework that came to mind like sitting in a brainstorming session in my home office, or in the context of like, okay, let me write a book. What should I call it? It truly was born from this deeply personal moment. And over the years, what I've realized is that that lens of the path of least regret applies not just in a health crisis, but in so many aspects of our life, whether it's in business, in our careers, in our relationships. And I'm explicit in the fact that it's not the path of no regret. I think it's inevitable that who we're going to be in the future, and, you know, how an outcome might turn out. If it doesn't turn out the way we want, if what we end up valuing in the future is actually different than we thought it would be, we might have some nagging regret or some nagging question of what if. What the path of least regret is about is recognizing that, but knowing that we approach the decisions with as much intention in the process, collected the information that we could, and were clear about what those risks and trade-offs are based on what we valued in that moment, that if we were to go back and make that decision again with the context of that time, knowing that we wouldn't have made a different decision with the information we had at that time.
I feel like the most important word of that statement and question that you ask is the idea of the word least. Because I think and this is one of my pet peeves, Parul, is when you hear someone say, I have no regrets. I'm like, and part of my French, bullshit. Because if
Yeah.
you don't have any regrets, that means you're a sociopath and and have lived a life that no one else could understand. So this idea of least regret, and it's funny too, because did you feel like as you were going through this and obviously putting it out on paper and writing about it, then it becomes a book, that like when you came upon that title, were you like, wait, no one's ever used this title before? Like, no one, like to me, like I wrote a book a few years ago called Good Listen. I was like, wait, no one ever wrote a book called Good Listen in the history of books. But this idea of path of least regret, were you like, and I often say like the best ideas are something that sounds like it's already been made before. Like it sounds like someone's already done this, but you did. What was that realization like? Like, wait a minute, no one's ever done this before?
So there's been several coins like that. One actually came very early on in 2014 when I was going through my cancer journey, because at that same time, Joan London, who was the like 20 plus year host of, I believe it was the Today
Good
Show or
Morning
Good Morning
America.
America, Good Morning America, right? She actually was going through breast cancer treatment at the same time. And through a sequence of events, we actually got connected and had a 1 hour phone call, just sharing our experiences of going through the diagnosis journey, the difficulty of making a treatment plan. And I shared with her this approach that I had, and this phrase that, like, ultimately I made my decision based on what would be my path of least regret. And she loved it. And I remember thinking in that moment, I'm like, oh my God, Joan London's gonna use the path of least regret. Like she's gonna go run with it on her platform. Um, but like just realizing that it resonated so well with someone like, just with like her and where she was in her life, and yet she had never heard it before. And, that was so many years ago now, and I've been using it in my writing, in my speaking, and, my coaching. But yeah, the fact that whenever people write about regret, they're thinking about it differently than what I write about, because how it's usually being spoken about is from this backward looking concept. It's about how do you live a life of no regrets, and or if it is the positive spin on regrets, it's how can you learn from your past regrets. What hasn't been written, and what this book, The Path of Least Regret, does is it actually flips it on its head and says, how can regret actually be a forward looking compass that informs our decision making in the moment at the crossroads that we're at, and frame it around not learning from the past, but for optimizing for the future and optimizing for the peace of mind that ultimately is what we want in life, because we recognize that there's so much that's out of our control. And yet what we do have control over is the process that we go through in the decision making, what clarity we have around our values, our priorities, whatever it is that we're solving for as far as that decision goes. And knowing that if we were thorough and intentional about that clarity and made that decision based on what we valued at the time and what information we could collect at the time, then that's using this idea of, knowing that I'm not going to, wonder or regret, like, what if I just had taken more time to know what I was actually solving for, know what I actually cared about, or even collected this other piece of information that was available. And so it's really about minimizing that future regret by seizing control of the present.
Love it. All right, before we get to the framework, I want to do a status check. And I know it's not really a spoiler because you're here, you're fine, you're living, but tell me about the health journey. Congratulations on what you've done and survived the whole thing. But to give us so folks can understand, like, I don't want to just go by and be like, so how you feeling? Like, tell me about your current your health state there, Parul.
No, thank you for asking, and thankfully everything is well. I have been in remission for over 11 years now, which is a huge milestone. But the 5-year mark itself is an important one, and then of course it only gets better from there. The journey has had its ups and downs, for sure. The reason I uh, had an awareness that I might have an early stage breast cancer when I first felt a lump is because I've had genetic testing done, and I know I have a high risk for ovarian and breast cancer. And so in 2014 is when I had the breast cancer diagnosis, and there had been an ovarian cancer scare in the years since then. But thankfully all is well, and I am energized and loving what I'm doing, and feel like I have also gone through a very hard time, but have found this way to create meaning from it in the work that I'm doing now. And there's so much healing that comes from that too.
Awesome. So let's dig into the framework now because you explain it in a sort of phases like awareness, processing, exploration, decision, and adaptation. Which phase do you think most people struggle with the most? And I know this is almost like picking like your most favorite child or most difficult child, but like, is one of those phases harder than most for others?
So the decision phase of the 5 phase framework is where people get really stuck. And that's where you can think of it as like the crossroads, or like being trapped in indecision or paralysis. And when it comes to the path of least regret in its, moment of birth, in my mind, it was truly at the decision phase where, okay, option A, option B, which one do I move forward with? Do I actually create an option C? Right? It's like that actual crossroad. The reason there needs to be a broader framework around just that decision point, though, is because what I realized is while people find themselves stuck in that decision phase the most, there's this whole emotional journey that has actually happened before they even reach that crossroads. That if they haven't navigated those phases as effectively as needed, that's exacerbating the decision making problem. And so those earlier phases where it comes to actually looking inward and recognizing what is feeling wrong, like what is it a an external unwanted curveball that is um, kind of dropping this decline in your mental well-being? Is it this like inertia that you've been trapped in because you've just been slaving away at the same job for year after year, or staying in a relationship that's no longer serving you, but you just like haven't been able to create the change that you wanted? Like being able to actually recognize your feelings, honor them, and name them so you truly are like addressing head on the tension that you're feeling between like what exists and what you actually want. That awareness is required to be honored before you can then move forward. The problem though is like as much as you want to like honor those feelings and give yourself permission to feel those feelings, you also don't want to get trapped in them. And so that's what that processing phase is really about is what are those mental roadblocks that might actually be keeping you trapped in rumination or paralysis that's preventing you from making that decision.
And so breaking that down and comparing it to like say other regret minimization approaches, I think Jeff Bezos has one too.
Yes.
What do you think differs? Like, what do you think? Like when someone say like, what's because people think, oh, handle regret. I'm sure there's so many ways you can handle it. What? How do you differentiate yours from others?
Yeah, and I actually explicitly speak about this in the book as well, because Jeff Bezos's regret minimization framework is anchored in the question that he asked himself, which is, what would my 80-year-old self most regret? And when people think about regret minimization, they're often thinking about his story, and they're often thinking about deathbed regret, what I'm calling deathbed regret. That is like at the end of my life, what are those, things that I'll potentially wonder if, what if I had done this? And so while that's like a compelling concept in terms of like how to think about regret and how to minimize it, the challenge is it has limitations, and a very important one that is anchored in psychology and like how we operate as humans, which is that what we value today may not actually be what we value in the future. And there's this concept called the illusion of continuity, that uh, believes that who we are today is who we're always going to be. So if we look backwards, we know that who we were 20 years ago has changed significantly from who we are now. And what we valued and cared about back then is very different from who we are now. But we don't carry that same awareness that, like, okay, so the 20-year into the future version of me might actually also be a very different person than who I am now. And so when we're trying to solve for a future self that far into the future, especially, we it's like we're trying to make decisions for someone we don't know. And so what my framework does, what the path of least regret does, is provide a roadmap for, instead of trying to solve for a future self, how do you solve for your present self with an understanding that the future is unknown, but redefining the success of the decision and the outcome based on the present and the present process that you go through, as opposed to a future self and a future outcome that you can't control for a person that you don't actually know.
Mm. I love that. And it's funny because if you compare the two and you talk about the Bezos one, it almost seems like it's a grander one because it's almost like you're only thinking about the major things in your life that you're going to regret and not like the micro regrets, that if you are
Mhm.
looking at present mind or looking within just a few years, you might be a little more focused on. But if you're thinking about it from your, like you said, deathbed, you're probably only thinking about, should I marry this person or should I take this job? And not thinking about those little moments that happen in between, which can serve as so much regret, maybe subliminally or maybe deep down into your consciousness, but it's still going to be there. So in a way, it's a more nuanced way of dealing with regret. Am I right with that?
Yes, that's right. Two thoughts I want to say on that. One is when we think about deathbed regret, it is putting weight in these bigger decisions in a way that doesn't recognize the nuances of the present. So, for example, you can say, oh, well, when I'm 80, I'm going to regret not having quit my job and started a startup. But in the moment of your life, whether that makes sense or not, it's not only your 80-year-old self that you're solving for. You're also solving for potentially like the stability of your family, the kids that need to, like, their schooling might need to be paid for. Like, there's other considerations, there's other people. And so while your 80-year-old self might one day wonder, like, oh, what if I had, like, you know, thrown caution to the wind and made this big leap? If in the present you're being thoughtful about, okay, do I have the financial stability to potentially not have an income for X number of years while I pursue this? What is the impact on my loved ones and the other people whose lives are impacted by my decisions? You may land in like, yes, I can take that risk and I should go for it, and the support is there. Or you may realize, okay, on one hand, I'd love to take that risk, but the financial stability is not there. The potential risks in my present world outweigh that ambition. And while one day I might wonder what could have gone differently, I'll know that I was thoughtful and intentional about all of the risks and trade offs. And so I made a decision that mattered and made sense at that time. So uh, that's one thought. Just in terms of like 80-year-old self versus what the realities of decision making in the present. And then the second point is, again, to your point around nuance, that this framework, even though it's laid out as this 5-phase framework and there's this whole journey and everything, it can actually be a decision-making process that happens in the blink of an eye for certain decisions, for those micro decisions. It's not like, oh, my 80-year-old self, do I move to this city? Do I marry this person? The path of least regret could even apply of, do I go to this party this weekend? Like being able to in my mind, jump to the end of the weekend, think about how I want to feel, how do I want to exert my energy, what is it that I'm solving for over like this Saturday night, and how does this decision of whether to go to this outing, fit into it or not. Like that's a silly, more trivial example, but the reality is that I have people share that with me all the time, that I'm going to choose my path of least regret for this activity. My daughters use path of least regret for deciding if they're going to audition for the school musical or if they're going to run for student government. My coaching clients have used the path of least regret for making a career transition or deciding to move in order to be closer to their aging parents for caregiving. And so there's this whole spectrum of life's decisions from the micro to the macro that this framework applies to, which is so important because when you think about decision making, especially when it comes to those decisions that matter most to us, we've never actually been taught how to make those decisions.
Mm. And let's talk about decision making. That's something you write about in the book, decision making, and you just made reference to it. So we've all seen the cliche, perfect is the enemy of good, and or whatever the heck that thing is supposed to go. But you talk about the fact that when it comes to perfection, you argue that perfection is the wrong goal. Now, how do you define perfection? Because I think, is it perfection like rainbows and unicorns? Is perfect like everything is just hunky dory? Like, because I think when people throw around that word perfect, like no one really knows what perfect really means if you think about it, because perfect could be many things to many people. So tell me about how you argue that perfection is the wrong goal.
In this context, perfection translates to certainty. So when we are faced with a decision, if we are seeking certainty, then we're never going to find like fulfillment in our decision making process, or comfort with even like ultimately making a decision, because like I've mentioned before, there are so many decisions that we have to make where the answer does not actually lie in the data. It does not lie in something that can be analyzed and assessed. And if we just look at enough data points and analyze them in the right way, that we will be certain of the outcome, right? That we will be certain if we build versus buy as a company, we're going to achieve the results we want. If, we go with this treatment plan or not, it's going to get the results we want. If we, you know, marry this person or not, we're going to be like happy forever, right? There is no certainty. So not perfect as in, you know, rainbows like you were saying, or some like paradise outcome, but it's just this conviction that what we want will actually happen. And when we anchor our decisions in pursuit of like solving for like a specific outcome, then we're trying to solve for something we can't control, because there will inevitably be external factors, luck, like macro societal events, right? Like just things that can change the course of our path. And so when I say that we're not seeking perfection or solving for perfection, it's that we can't solve for certainty, but what we can do is solve for clarity. And this book is about guiding people through a process that helps clarify for them what their North Star is, what they're actually solving for when in the context of that decision, and then helping them make it with as much resilience and intentionality as they can.
I'm going to use an old school term that people sometimes still use, and that's FOMO, fear of missing out. How does the path of least regret help with FOMO? Because even though the kids have stopped using the word FOMO, we all still feel it. We all know what it
Is that
means.
not a thing anymore? I have
I don't think it's as cool as it was when we were using it,
Yeah,
Parul.
that's
But I tell you
probably
about
true.
how it helps. You mentioned the fact about like when people talk about like their weekend plans, something. But like, give me an example of how it could help prevent us from like not fear, removing that fear of missing out.
Yes. Well, honestly, it applies on both sides, whether it's FOMO, the fear of missing out, or this other angle of JOMO, like the joy of missing out, right? Like that also then came later on. And so um what it's about, and especially when you think of like the population of high achievers, for example, who are, you could say that people in business are often type A overachievers, and the challenge of being wired like that or in that industry is that there is this like comparison that can happen, right? Because if you've achieved some milestone in your career, you're then surrounded by other people who have always also done the same and might be pushing ahead and succeeding at some other new level. And so there's this temptation to want to kind of continue on that rat race, to continue to meet those higher and higher bars. And when it comes to the path of least regret, if you are actually clear on what matters to you, and if you define that as your ambition and your professional achievement as defined by income or title or company, then that might be your reason for continuing on, on that rat race. If it's defined as the relationships that you have in your life, the experiences as, that you're if you're at a point where like you have that financial flexibility and you have that luxury to be able to uh, invest in travel and connection, then you might actually realize that there's peace of mind for you to step off that rat race or to slow it down, where on one hand it could feel like FOMO, or like you could worry about FOMO because others around you might still be just gunning ahead, pedal to the metal. And you, you know, if you're not intentional about that decision, you might have a lot more regret around, oh, I should have like continued because I could have been making this much money, or I could have, I worked at this company with the same person and now look what they've done versus like where I'm at in my career. But if you're approaching all of those decisions with that clarity of what you are actually solving for, then there's that peace of mind that comes with knowing that you solved for your priorities, even if those looked different than what the other person might have been solving for in theirs.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so if someone is standing at a major crossroads in their life today and they don't have time to finish your book, but eventually they will, what is the first question they should ask themselves?
On one hand, I want to be like, well, just ask yourself, what's your path of least regret? Because oftentimes just that framing can be clarifying itself. But what I would actually have them start with is, what am I feeling? When we think about change or a struggle or a stressor in our life, then just thinking about it actually makes us very reactive in the moment. It's just like triggering our stress hormones. But if we can actually name how we're feeling and identify like what the tension actually is, then not only are we wiring our brain to actually be more proactive in our problem solving and forward looking and in the process, but we're also starting ourselves on this journey of understanding what the tension is, what that feeling of what's not right and what's not working actually is. And only then can we know what is it we're addressing and the decision that we're needing to make, how, which of those options or which option can be created that's going to actually best address that underlying feeling.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so Parul, I always wrap up these conversations taking folks behind the dedication of the book, and you dedicated to your daughters the brightest lights guiding me on my path. Why was it so important to dedicate the book to your kids?
Because for me, ultimately, if my daughters are the only two people who read this book and it helps them lead more fulfilling and peaceful lives in their adulthood, it will have made the entire journey of getting all of these thoughts on paper more than worth it. And so it was just a no-brainer that everything that I'm doing is in service of them at this point.
The name of the book, The Path of Least Regret, Decide with Clarity, Move Forward with Confidence. She is Parul Somani. Parul, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thanks, Joe.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Parul and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.